I dragged my duffel bag from the passenger seat and stood next to my beat-up Honda, looking up at the two-story farmhouse that hadn't changed much since I was 12. The white paint still peeled around the window frames, and the wraparound porch still sagged slightly on the left side where the foundation had settled years ago. Even the old metal milk can by the front steps sat in the same spot, now serving as a planter for Sarah's petunias. The gravel driveway crunched under my sneakers as I made my way toward the house, memories of childhood summers flooding back. I'd spent weeks here every year until high school took over my life, running through these same fields and helping Sarah with the chickens. Back then, the farm had felt magical in that way. Places do when you're young, and everything seems bigger than it actually is. Sarah appeared on the porch before I reached the steps, wiping her hands on a dish towel. Her hair had gone completely gray since I'd seen her last Christmas, but she still moved with that no-nonsense energy I remembered. Madison. She pulled me into one of her signature hugs, the kind that squeezed tight enough to crack your ribs. Look at you, all grown up and ready to get your hands dirty. Thanks for letting me stay, Aunt Sarah. I really needed to get out of the city for a while. She held me at arm's length, studying my face with those sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. Month of farm work will do you good. But first, we need to talk. The warmth in her voice shifted to something more serious, and she motioned for me to follow her inside. The kitchen looked exactly the same. Same yellow curtains, same oak table with the burn mark from when I'd set a hot pot down without a trivet at age 10. Sarah gestured for me to sit while she moved to the counter and picked up a piece of paper. Before you settle in, there are some rules you need to know about. She placed the paper in front of me. 6 of them, non-negotiable. I looked down at the handwritten list, recognizing Sarah's careful cursive. The paper looked like it had been folded and unfolded many times, edges worn soft. Rule 1, never look the scarecrow in the eye. Rule 2, feed the farm cat twice daily at 8 a.m. and 6 p.m. exactly. Rule 3, always be polite to the scarecrow. Rule 4, close all barn doors before sunset. Rule 5, never feed any animals after dark. Rule 6, do not go into the woods for any reason. I read through the list twice, waiting for Sarah to crack a smile or tell me this was some kind of elaborate family joke. When I looked up, her expression remained completely serious. You're kidding, right? I laughed, tapping the paper. This is like some old family tradition thing? Scare the city girl with weird farm superstitions? I'm not kidding. Sarah's tone cut through my amusement like a blade. These rules aren't suggestions, Madison. Your safety depends on following them exactly as written. The laughter died in my throat. Sarah had always been practical, level-headed. She'd been the one to teach me to drive stick shift when my dad said I wasn't ready. The one who'd talked me through my first heartbreak over the phone. Seeing her this serious about a list that mentioned being polite to a scarecrow made something cold settle in my stomach. Come on, Sarah. You want me to be polite to a pile of hay and old clothes? I want you to follow the rules. She sat down across from me, leaning forward with her elbows on the table. Some things on this farm require respect and caution. That's all you need to know. But why? What happens if I don't? The rules exist for good reasons, Madison. That's all I'm going to say about it. She stood up, smoothing her hands over her jeans. You agreed to help me for a month. These are the conditions. I stared at the list again, trying to make sense of it. The scarecrow rules seemed particularly odd, and the part about not feeding animals after dark made no practical sense at all. But Sarah's expression told me this conversation was over. Fine, I'll follow your rules. I folded the paper and tucked it into my pocket, even the weird ones. Especially the weird ones. That evening, after Sarah had shown me to my old room upstairs and I'd unpacked my bag, I stood at my bedroom window looking out over the farm. The cornfield stretched to my left, and I could just make out the dark shape of the scarecrow in the center, arms outstretched. To my right, the barn stood with its red paint faded to a dusty rust color. I was about to turn away when I noticed Sarah walking toward the barn, flashlight in hand even though it wasn't fully dark yet. She approached the first building, a smaller structure that housed the chickens, and checked the door. Then she walked to the main barn and did the same thing, rattling the latch to make sure it held. She moved to the equipment shed next, testing that door as well. But instead of heading back to the house, she started the whole circuit again. Check the chicken coop, rattle the latch. Check the main barn, test the door. Check the shed, make sure it's secure. I watched her make this circuit 3 times before she finally seemed satisfied and headed back toward the farmhouse. The methodical way she checked each door, the careful attention to every latch, made the cold feeling in my stomach grow stronger. Maybe Sarah's rules weren't as ridiculous as they seemed. I woke up determined to prove that Sarah's rules were nothing more than harmless family quirks. The list sat folded on my nightstand and I grabbed it while getting dressed, reading through the 6 items one more time. Being polite to a scarecrow still struck me as ridiculous, even after watching Sarah's methodical door-checking routine the night before. The kitchen was empty when I came downstairs, but Sarah had left a note explaining the morning chores. Feed the chickens at 8 sharp, collect the eggs, check the water troughs, and measure out grain for the afternoon feeding. Basic farm work that I remembered from childhood visits. Nothing supernatural about any of it. I found the chicken feed in the barn and filled a metal bucket, the familiar weight, bringing back memories of helping Sarah when I was 10. The chickens clucked and flapped around my legs as I scattered the grain, their routine unchanged by all the mysterious rules Sarah insisted on following. Collecting eggs took longer than I expected. The hens had chosen some creative hiding spots, and I had to crawl under the roost to retrieve 2 stragglers. The work felt good, though, physical and straightforward, with clear results that made sense. But as I moved around the chicken coop, I became aware of the cornfield stretching out beyond the fence. The scarecrow stood exactly where I remembered it from my bedroom window, arms extended on a wooden crossbeam, head tilted at that slight angle that made it look almost thoughtful. I kept my eyes focused on the ground or the chickens, deliberately avoiding looking in its direction. The sensation started about an hour into the morning chores, a prickle between my shoulder blades like someone watching me work. I told myself it was just nerves, that Sarah's warnings had gotten into my head more than I wanted to admit. But the feeling persisted as I checked the water troughs and carried feed buckets between buildings. When I finally glanced toward the cornfield, the scarecrow appeared to be facing my direction. Its painted face pointed straight toward the area where I was working, even though I could have sworn it had been looking toward the farmhouse earlier. The angle of its head, the way its arms hung from the crossbeam, everything about its position seemed different. I forced myself to focus on the work. Scarecrows didn't move. They were hay and old clothes stuffed into a framework designed to scare birds away from the corn. Nothing more complicated than that. Sarah's rules were just her way of maintaining old family traditions, probably passed down from grandparents who believed in all sorts of country superstitions. The feeling of being watched grew stronger as the morning progressed. Every time I moved to a new area of the farmyard, I found myself aware of the scarecrow's position. When I cleaned the water trough near the equipment shed, it seemed to be angled toward me. When I moved feed bags from the barn to the storage area, the scarecrow's head appeared to track my movement. By afternoon, I was actively avoiding looking in its direction. The sixth sense that told me someone was watching had become impossible to ignore, and I caught myself glancing over my shoulder more frequently than made any practical sense. I was carrying 2 heavy buckets of grain toward the chicken coop when it happened. The buckets were awkward, and I had to adjust my grip to keep from dropping them. As I looked up to check my path, my eyes met the scarecrow's painted face directly. The contact lasted maybe half a second, but something cold rushed through me immediately. The scarecrow's black dot eyes seemed to focus on mine with an awareness that made my stomach drop. Then its head moved. Just slightly, tilting a few degrees to the right like it was studying me more carefully. I dropped one of the buckets. "Sorry," I said aloud, the word coming out before I could stop it. "I didn't mean to look, I'm sorry." The scarecrow remained motionless, head tilted at that new angle, but the cold feeling in my chest began to fade. I picked up the spilled bucket, grain scattered across the dirt, and walked quickly toward the chicken coop without looking back. My hands shook slightly as I poured the remaining feed into the trough. The chickens pecked at the grain like nothing had happened, completely oblivious to the fact that I'd just apologized to a pile of hay and old clothes, which was exactly what I should be thinking, except that the apology had felt necessary in a way I couldn't explain. When I finished with the chickens and finally worked up the courage to look toward the cornfield again, the scarecrow was back in its original position, head facing toward the farmhouse, arms hanging at the same angle I remembered from the morning, like it had never moved at all. I found Sarah in the kitchen that evening, stirring something that smelled like beef stew. She looked up when I came in, taking in what must have been a pretty obvious expression of confusion. "How were the morning chores?" "Fine," I said, then hesitated. "Sarah, about the scarecrow." "What about it? Does it ever... have you noticed if it changes position during the day?" Sarah set down her wooden spoon and turned to face me fully. Her expression remained neutral, but I caught something in her eyes that might have been approval. "Did you follow the first rule?" I looked at it by accident, but I apologized right away. "Good." She picked up the spoon again and went back to stirring. "Some rules exist for good reasons, Madison. That's all you need to know. But that doesn't answer my question." "Yes, it does." I stood there for another moment, waiting for more explanation that clearly wasn't coming. Sarah's tone had that same finality it had carried when she'd first shown me the list. The conversation was over whether I wanted it to be or not. That night, as I got ready for bed, I folded the rule list carefully and placed it back on the nightstand. The first rule no longer seemed quite as ridiculous as it had that morning. Neither did the third one about being polite. I fell asleep wondering what the other 4 rules were really protecting me from. The bleeding woke me from a dream I couldn't remember. I lay there in the dark, trying to figure out what I'd heard, when the sound came again. High-pitched and desperate, like a lamb calling for its mother. I rolled over and checked my phone. Just past midnight. The sound echoed across the field behind the farmhouse, muffled by the walls, but clear enough to make my chest tighten. Something was wrong out there. The bleeding continued, each cry more pitiful than the last. I sat up in bed, pushing hair out of my face and listening harder. It definitely sounded like a baby sheep, maybe separated from the flock or caught in a fence somewhere. Every instinct I had told me to get up and help. Then Sarah's 5th rule popped into my head: never feed any animals after dark. I stayed put for another few minutes, hoping the crying would stop. Maybe whatever was out there would find its way back to safety on its own. But the bleeding kept going, regular as a heartbeat, and I couldn't just lie there listening to an animal suffer. I grabbed the flashlight from my nightstand and padded barefoot to the window. The moon was bright enough to see the field clearly, and I pressed my face against the glass, scanning for movement. There. About 50 yards out, a small white shape stood alone in the grass. It looked exactly like a lamb, maybe 3 or 4 months old. The kind that would definitely be calling for its mother if it got lost. The poor thing was just standing there, head thrown back, mouth open as it cried. My hand was already on the window latch when I stopped myself. Rule number 5 wasn't about feeding specifically. It was about not dealing with animals after dark at all. Sarah had been very clear about that, and after what happened with the scarecrow yesterday, I was starting to take her warnings more seriously. I watched the lamb for another minute, trying to decide what to do. It wasn't moving much, just shifting its weight from foot to foot while it bleated. Something about that bothered me, though I couldn't put my finger on what. Then I listened more carefully to the sound itself. The bleeding was too regular, too perfect. Each cry lasted exactly the same length of time, with exactly the same pause between them, like someone playing a recording on repeat rather than an actual animal in distress. I leaned closer to the window, studying the white shape more intently. As I watched, it moved forward a few steps, but not in the flowing way sheep moved. The motion was jerky, mechanical, like something being pulled on strings. The bleating changed suddenly, becoming more rhythmic, more musical. And underneath the animal sound, I could hear something else, a pattern that almost sounded like words, like someone humming a tune while imitating a sheep's cry. My stomach dropped. I backed away from the window quickly, clutching the flashlight against my chest. The sound continued outside, but now I could hear how artificial it really was, how deliberately it was being made to sound distressed and helpless. Whatever was out there in the field wasn't a lamb. I stayed as far from the window as possible for the rest of the night, sitting on my bed with my back against the headboard. The fake bleating went on for about an hour before finally stopping, leaving the farm in complete silence. I didn't sleep much after that. When the sun came up, I forced myself to look out the window again. The field was empty, just grass waving in the morning breeze. No sign that anything had been out there at all. After getting dressed, I walked around the entire property, checking Sarah's sheep pasture and counting heads. All 12 animals were exactly where they should be, clustered around their water trough like they'd been there all night. Sarah was already working in the garden when I came back to the farmhouse, pulling weeds from around her tomato plants. She looked up when she heard my footsteps on the gravel. "Morning, Madison. Sleep well?" "Fine," I said, then hesitated. "Sarah, do you ever have problems with lambs getting separated from the flock?" "Not really. My sheep stick close to home." She straightened up, brushing dirt off her hands. "Why do you ask?" I almost told her about the bleeding, about the white shape in the field and the way it moved wrong. But something held me back. Maybe it was the way she'd refused to explain the rules before, or maybe I just wasn't ready to admit how thoroughly spooked I'd been. Just wondering. The pasture fence looked secure when I checked it. Good. Sarah went back to her weeding. Staying aware of the animals is important. I spent the rest of the morning doing chores, feeding the chickens and collecting eggs while carefully avoiding eye contact with the scarecrow. But I kept thinking about rule number 5 and how Sarah hadn't just warned against feeding animals after dark. She'd made it clear that dealing with any animals after sunset was off limits. Now I understood why. I spent most of the next day fixing a section of pasture fence that had come loose during the last storm. The work turned out to be more involved than I expected, requiring me to dig out 2 fence posts that had shifted and reset them with fresh concrete. My hands were covered in dirt and splinters by late afternoon, but I was determined to finish the job properly. The rhythmic hammering and the satisfaction of seeing the fence lines straighten out made me lose track of everything else. I worked methodically, checking each post for stability and tightening the wire mesh between them. The physical labor felt good after days of adjusting to Sarah's mysterious rules and the farm's unsettling supernatural residents. When I finally stepped back to admire the completed repair, the sky had turned that deep purple color that comes just before full darkness. My stomach dropped as I realized what time it was. The barn doors. Rule number 4. I was supposed to close all barn doors before sunset, and I could see from where I stood that the main barn entrance hung wide open. I dropped my hammer and ran toward the building, gravel crunching under my boots. Sarah had been very clear about this rule, and after what I'd experienced with the fake lamb bleating, I wasn't about to test what happened when the rules got broken. But as I approached the barn, I found something blocking my path. The large orange tabby cat sat directly in front of the open doors, planted like a furry roadblock between me and the entrance. Its tail twitched back and forth, and its green eyes locked on mine with an intensity that made me pause. "Move, cat," I said, trying to step around it. "I need to close these doors." The cat yowled loudly and shifted to block my new path. When I tried going to the left, it darted in front of me again. When I moved right, it mirrored my movement perfectly, keeping itself positioned between me and the barn entrance. "Come on," I said, crouching down and reaching toward it. "I'm already late with this. Sarah's going to kill me." The cat's fur stood on end all along its back, creating a ridge that made it look twice its normal size. It arched its spine and hissed when my hand got within 2 feet of it, ears flattened against its head. Everything about its posture screamed warning. I stopped trying to get past it and really looked at the animal. This was the same cat Sarah insisted I feed exactly on schedule, the one she treated with careful respect during our daily routines. Its behavior wasn't random or territorial. It was deliberately preventing me from entering the barn. The understanding hit me like a physical blow. Something was wrong. Something was inside the barn that shouldn't be there, and the cat was protecting me from walking into it. I backed away slowly, keeping my eyes on the cat as I retreated toward the farmhouse. Its fur began to settle slightly, but it remained stationed at the barn entrance, watching me go. "Sarah," I called as I reached the porch. "Sarah, I need help." She appeared at the kitchen door, wiping her hands on a dish towel. Her expression shifted immediately when she saw my face. "What happened?" "I forgot about the barn doors, lost track of time fixing the fence. But the cat won't let me near the barn. It's blocking the entrance and acting like something's wrong." Sarah dropped the dish towel and grabbed a heavy flashlight from the counter. She moved past me quickly, her stride purposeful and steady as she headed toward the barn. I followed her, but stayed well back, watching as she approached the orange tabby. The cat remained in position, but its posture relaxed slightly when it saw Sarah coming. She stopped about 10 feet from the entrance and put 2 fingers to her lips, producing a soft, melodic whistle. The sound carried across the farmyard, sweet and low. Sarah waited, head tilted slightly as if listening for a response. From deep inside the barn came a low, growling sound. Not quite animal, not quite human, but something that made every muscle in my body tense up. The growl seemed to move around inside the building, echoing off the walls and wooden beams. Sarah whistled again, the same gentle melody. The growling grew louder for a moment, then gradually began to fade. I could hear movement inside the barn, like something large shifting through the hay and equipment. The sound receded deeper into the building, becoming fainter until it disappeared entirely. Only then did the orange tabby step aside, moving with graceful precision to clear the path to the barn doors. Sarah walked forward calmly and grabbed the heavy door handle, pulling the massive wooden panel shut with a solid thunk. She slid the metal latch into place and tested it twice to make sure it held secure. "There," she said, turning back toward me. "Problem solved." I stared at the closed barn, my hands shaking slightly from adrenaline I was only now beginning to feel. What was that thing? Something that comes around when the doors stay open too long after dark. Sarah picked up the cat, which purred loudly in her arms. "This little guardian saved you from making a serious mistake." The cat looked at me over Sarah's shoulder, its green eyes bright and alert. I reached out tentatively and scratched behind its ears, feeling the vibration of its purr against my fingertips. "Thank you," I whispered to the cat. "I'm sorry I didn't listen right away." Sarah carried the cat back toward the farmhouse while I took one last look at the securely latched barn. The building appeared completely normal now, just weathered red wood and a metal roof catching moonlight. But I could still hear that growl in my memory, and I knew I'd never forget the sound. Back in the kitchen, I found the bag of cat treats Sarah kept on the counter and filled a small bowl. The orange tabby ate with obvious satisfaction while I watched, marveling at how alert and intelligent it seemed. "The feeding schedule isn't just about keeping it healthy, is it?" I asked Sarah. "No. Regular feeding maintains the bond. The cat needs to know it belongs here, that this is its territory to protect." Sarah refilled the cat's water bowl and set it down. "Trust works both ways on this farm. I spent the next hour sitting on the kitchen floor, offering the cat treat after treat and running my hands through its soft orange fur. Each purr felt like forgiveness, like acceptance into some kind of partnership I was only beginning to understand. When I finally went to bed that night, I took the rule list from my nightstand and read through it one more time. But now the words looked different. Instead of arbitrary restrictions, they read like a survival guide written by people who understood exactly what they were protecting against. I folded the paper carefully and placed it back on the nightstand, no longer questioning the wisdom behind any of Sarah's requirements. I woke up feeling different than I had any morning since arriving at the farm. The anxiety that had been sitting in my chest for days was gone, replaced by something steadier, calmer. I knew exactly what I needed to do and when I needed to do it. The rule list stayed folded on my nightstand as I got dressed. I didn't need to read it anymore. Each requirement had become part of my routine, woven into the fabric of how I moved through my days here. Downstairs, Sarah had left the usual note about morning chores, but I barely glanced at it. Feed the chickens at 8 sharp, collect eggs, check water levels. Basic tasks I could handle with my eyes closed. What mattered now was doing them the right way. I filled the metal bucket with chicken feed and headed outside, but instead of going straight to the coop, I walked toward the cornfield first. The scarecrow stood in its usual position, arms stretched wide on the wooden crossbeam, head tilted at that slight angle that had once seemed so unsettling. "Good morning," I said aloud, keeping my eyes focused on its painted shirt rather than its face. "I hope you had a peaceful night." The scarecrow didn't move, but something about its posture felt less rigid than before, less like a warning and more like acknowledgement. I had no idea if it actually heard me or cared what I said, but Sarah's third rule was clear about being polite, and politeness had never hurt anyone. The chickens clustered around my legs as I scattered grain across their run, their routine unchanged by my new approach to farm life. But I moved differently now, more aware of the rhythms and patterns that governed this place. The orange tabby appeared while I worked, weaving between the fence posts with feline grace. "Hey there," I said, crouching down to scratch behind its ears. "Ready for breakfast?" The cat purred and rubbed against my palm, then followed me as I finished the chicken chores and headed back toward the farmhouse. It stayed close throughout the morning, padding along beside me as I checked water troughs and moved feed buckets between buildings. At exactly 8 o'clock, I filled the cat's bowl with the precise amount of food Sarah had shown me. The orange tabby sniffed at the kibble but didn't eat immediately, more interested in watching a butterfly that had landed near the porch steps. I left the food where it was and continued with my work. The cat would eat when it was ready. What mattered was maintaining the schedule, keeping the routine that Sarah insisted was so important for the farm's balance. By mid-morning, I found myself moving through tasks with an efficiency I hadn't felt since arriving. Every action had purpose, every rule had meaning. The supernatural residents of this place weren't threats to be feared, but neighbors to be respected, part of an ecosystem that had functioned for generations. When I finished cleaning the water trough near the equipment shed, I walked back toward the cornfield to check on some irrigation equipment Sarah had mentioned. The scarecrow came into view as I approached, and I gave it a small wave. "Back again," I said, "just checking the sprinkler heads." I spent about 20 minutes examining the irrigation lines, making notes about which heads needed cleaning and which sections might need repair. The work required me to move through several rows of corn, but I made sure to announce my presence each time I entered a new area. "Excuse me," I said to the scarecrow as I passed near its position. "Just need to check this last section, then I'll be out of your way." When I finished and gathered my tools, I looked toward the scarecrow one final time. "All done. Thank you for letting me work in your field." I could have sworn its head tilted slightly, just a degree or two, but the movement was so subtle I might have imagined it. What I didn't imagine was the feeling of approval that seemed to settle over the cornfield. like I'd passed some kind of test I hadn't known I was taking. The cat reappeared as I walked back toward the barn, having apparently finished its breakfast while I worked. It trotted alongside me with obvious contentment, tail held high like a flag. "Good meal?" I asked it. The cat chirped in response, a sound that might have been agreement. Lunch came and went with Sarah and me eating together in comfortable quiet. She seemed pleased with how I was handling the farm work, commenting that I'd settled into the routines faster than she'd expected. I didn't mention my conversations with the scarecrow, but something in her expression suggested she already knew about them. Around 2 in the afternoon, I decided to repair a section of fence near the woods that had been damaged by falling branches. The work was simple enough, just clearing debris and tightening wire that had come loose, but it put me closer to the tree line than I'd been since arriving. I'd been working for about an hour when I heard Sarah's voice calling from within the woods. "Madison! Madison, can you help me? I'm stuck!" I looked up from the fence post I'd been securing, tools still in my hands. The voice was perfect. Exactly Sarah's tone, her inflection, even the slight rasp she got when she'd been working outside all day. "Madison, please. I need help. I can't get out." My first instinct was to drop everything and run toward the trees. Sarah sounded genuinely distressed, like she might be caught in a deadfall or trapped under something heavy. Every part of me wanted to help. But rule number 6 sat in the back of my mind like a roadblock. Do not go into the woods for any reason. "Sarah?" I called out. "Are you okay? What happened?" "I was chasing one of the chickens that got loose. There's a fallen tree and my leg is caught. Please, Madison, I can't move it by myself." The voice grew more urgent, more desperate. It sounded exactly like what Sarah would say if she really was trapped. But something made me pause instead of rushing forward. I turned and looked back toward the farmhouse. Sarah was clearly visible in her garden, kneeling between rows of tomatoes with a basket beside her. She was maybe 200 yards away, but I could see her distinctly, pulling weeds and checking plants with the methodical care she brought to all her work. "Madison, please, it's getting worse. I think I might have broken something." The voice from the woods had become almost frantic, pleading with a desperation that tugged at every protective instinct I had. But Sarah continued working peacefully in her garden, completely unaware that something in the forest was using her voice to call for help. I backed away from the tree line, keeping my eyes on the real Sarah as the fake voice continued its urgent appeals. "I'm sorry," I said to the woods. "I can't help you." "Madison, don't leave me here, please. You have to help me." The voice grew more shrill, more demanding, but I kept walking backward until I was well clear of the forest edge. Only then did the calling stop, cutting off abruptly as if someone had flipped a switch. I gathered my tools and headed back toward the farmhouse, my hands shaking slightly from adrenaline. The encounter had lasted maybe 5 minutes, but it felt like hours. Sarah looked up from her tomatoes as I approached, shading her eyes with one dirt-covered hand. "Finished with that fence section already?" "Yeah," I said, setting down my toolbox. "Sarah, do you ever go into the woods?" "Never." She went back to her weeding. "Nothing good comes from those trees." I waited for her to elaborate, but she seemed focused entirely on her plants. After a moment, I decided to tell her what had happened. Something in there was calling for help, using your voice. It sounded exactly like you. Sarah's hand stilled on the tomato plants. She sat back on her heels and looked at me directly, her expression serious but not surprised. "And what did you do?" "I didn't go in. I looked over here and saw you working in the garden, so I knew it wasn't really you, but it was very convincing." "Good." Sarah's face broke into the first genuine smile I'd seen from her all week. "Very good. You're finally learning to trust the rules completely." She stood up and brushed dirt off her knees, looking pleased in a way that made my chest warm with something like pride. That's not the first time something has tried to lure people into those woods, and it won't be the last. but you listened to the rule instead of your instincts, and that probably saved your life. I stared at the tree line, which looked perfectly normal in the afternoon sunlight. Just oak and maple trees with a few patches of underbrush, nothing threatening or supernatural about any of it. What's in there? Things that are better left alone. Sarah picked up her basket of tomatoes. The important thing is that you stayed out. You proved you understand why the rules exist. That evening, I fed the orange cat at exactly 6 o'clock, measuring the food carefully and setting the bowl in its usual spot. The cat ate with obvious satisfaction while I sat nearby, scratching behind its ears and listening to its contented purring. When Sarah finished her own dinner, she joined me on the porch to watch the sun set over the fields. The scarecrow stood silhouetted against the orange sky, its arms spread wide like it was embracing the approaching night. "Thank you," I said quietly to the distant figure. Sarah glanced at me. "For what?" "For watching over everything. For keeping the farm safe." She nodded approvingly. Respect and gratitude go a long way here. The scarecrow understands courtesy better than most people realize. I felt a deep sense of calm settling over me as darkness approached. The farm's supernatural residents no longer seemed like threats to be feared, but guardians to be acknowledged, partners in maintaining the delicate balance that kept this place functioning. I fell asleep feeling secure and confident, knowing I was finally becoming part of something larger than myself, something that had protected this land and its caretakers for longer than anyone could remember. I'd been at the farm for a full week now, and something fundamental had shifted in how I moved through each day. The anxiety that had gripped me during those first few nights was completely gone, replaced by a sense of belonging I hadn't expected to find. My morning routine had become second nature. I woke up before my alarm, dressed quickly, and headed straight outside to greet the scarecrow before starting any other work. The polite acknowledgement felt as natural as brushing my teeth or making coffee. I'd walk to the edge of the cornfield, keep my eyes focused respectfully on its painted shirt, and offer a simple good morning. "Beautiful day today," I said during one particularly clear morning. "Hope you're doing well." The conversations were always brief, but they set the tone for everything that followed. I'd learned that respect was a currency on this farm, and spending it generously paid dividends in ways I was still discovering. Feeding the cat at exactly 8 and 6 had become one of my favorite parts of each day. The orange tabby would appear precisely on schedule, winding between my legs with obvious affection while I measured out its food. It no longer treated me like a stranger who might mess up the routine. Instead, it acted like I was part of the family, purring loudly when I scratched behind its ears and following me around the property during my morning chores. The barn doors were never a source of stress anymore. I developed an internal clock that reminded me well before sunset to make my rounds, checking each latch twice and making sure everything was secure. The methodical routine Sarah had demonstrated that first night now felt completely natural, like muscle memory I'd inherited from previous generations of caretakers. Even my approach to the woods had evolved from fearful avoidance to respectful acknowledgement. When my work took me near the tree line, I'd nod toward the forest and announce my presence, just as I did with the scarecrow. I never went closer than necessary, but I no longer felt the urgent need to run away from the edge of the property. The supernatural encounters that had terrified me during my first few days had become rare occurrences. No more fake lambs bleating in the middle of the night. No more mysterious growling from inside the barn. No more voices calling for help from the woods. The farm felt peaceful, almost ordinary, except for the constant awareness that I was sharing the space with guardians who watched over everything. That awareness had become comforting rather than frightening. I moved through my days knowing I was protected, that following the rules had earned me acceptance into some kind of ancient partnership between human caretakers and otherworldly residents. On Thursday evening, as I completed my final barn check of the day, I noticed something that made me pause mid-stride. The scarecrow had moved again, but not in the subtle way I'd observed during my early days here. This time the change was unmistakable. It now stood much closer to the farmhouse, maybe 30 yards from the porch instead of its usual position in the center of the cornfield. Someone had relocated the entire wooden framework, crossbeam and all, positioning it where it could monitor the farmyard directly. The painted face looked toward the house, arms spread wide in what seemed like a protective stance rather than a threatening one. My first reaction wasn't fear or confusion. Instead, I felt a warm sense of security, like having a trusted friend keep watch while I slept. The scarecrow's new position felt deliberate and caring, chosen to provide better coverage of the buildings and pathways where I spent most of my time. I walked toward it slowly, stopping at a respectful distance. "Thank you," I said aloud. "I appreciate you looking out for everything." The scarecrow remained perfectly still, but something about its posture conveyed approval. I'd learned to read its subtle communications over the past week, the way its head might tilt slightly when I approached, or how its arms seemed less rigid when I remembered to be polite. As I turned back toward the barn to finish locking up, the orange tabby appeared beside me, rubbing against my legs with obvious satisfaction. It purred loudly as I slid the heavy latch into place and tested it twice to make sure it held secure. "Good work today," the cat seemed to be saying through its contented rumbling. I crouched down and ran my hands through its soft fur, marveling at how completely my relationship with this animal had transformed. A week ago, it had been a mysterious creature that blocked my path and hissed when I tried to approach. Now it felt like a partner, someone who understood my role on the farm and approved of how I was handling the responsibilities. When I finished securing all the buildings and headed back toward the house, Sarah was waiting on the porch with 2 glasses of iced tea. She handed me one as I climbed the steps, and we settled into the wooden chairs that faced west toward the fields. The sun hung low on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that made the entire farm look like something from a painting. The scarecrow stood silhouetted against the colorful backdrop, its protective presence adding to the sense of peace that had settled over everything. "You've done well this week," Sarah said after a few minutes of comfortable silence. I sipped my tea and watched a hawk circle high above the cornfield. "It feels different now. Like I finally understand what I'm supposed to be doing here." "That's exactly right." Sarah's voice carried a warmth I hadn't heard before, like she was genuinely proud of my progress. "You've learned to work with the farm instead of fighting against it." We sat quietly for a while, watching the sun sink lower toward the tree line. The air was filled with the evening sounds I'd grown to love. Crickets starting their nightly chorus, chickens settling into their roosts, the distant rustle of corn stalks moving in the breeze. "This farm has been in our family for 4 generations," Sarah said eventually. "My great-grandmother was the first to figure out how to coexist peacefully with the guardians who were already here when she arrived." I turned to look at her, interested to finally hear some of the history I'd been curious about since my first day. She was a practical woman, like you. Noticed patterns in what worked and what didn't, wrote down the rules that kept everyone safe. Each caretaker since then has added to the knowledge, refined the approach, learned new ways to maintain the balance. The scarecrow and the cat have been here that long. Different individuals, same spirits. They're drawn to caretakers who show proper respect, who understand that this land belongs to all of us together. Sarah gestured toward the scarecrow's new position. That one has been watching over the farm for about 15 years now. Showed up right after my husband passed, like it knew I'd need extra help managing everything alone. The scarecrow's protective presence made even more sense now. It wasn't just a supernatural guardian doing its job. It was a longtime companion who had chosen to care for Sarah and her property. "What about the thing in the woods? The one that used your voice?" Sarah's expression grew more serious. "That's been here the longest. Probably existed before any humans settled this area. But it stays in the trees as long as we stay out and everyone benefits from the arrangement." And the thing that was in the barn that night comes and goes, shows up when the doors stay open too long after dark, moves on when we secure everything properly. It's not malicious, just opportunistic. I nodded, filing away these explanations with the growing understanding I'd developed over the past week. The supernatural residents weren't random threats or mysterious forces. They were neighbors with their own needs and boundaries, beings who could coexist peacefully with humans as long as everyone followed the established agreements. The sun touched the horizon, casting long shadows across the farmyard. The scarecrow's silhouette stretched toward the house, like it was reaching out to encompass everything under its protection. "Madison," Sarah said quietly, "you came here planning to stay for a month." "Yeah, that was the original plan." "How would you feel about making this arrangement more permanent?" I felt my chest warm with something like relief, like she was offering me exactly what I hadn't known I wanted. The past week had shown me a way of living I'd never experienced before. Purpose without stress, routine without boredom, community that included beings most people would never believe existed. "I've been thinking the same thing," I said. "This place feels more like home than anywhere I've lived in years." Sarah smiled, the expression transforming her entire face. "Good. The farm needs a caretaker who understands the rules, someone who can maintain the relationships we've built here. You've proven you can handle that responsibility." I looked out at the fields, the barn with its securely latched doors, the orange cat that had appeared on the porch and was now cleaning its paws with obvious contentment. The scarecrow stood guard in its new position, arms spread wide like it was embracing everything under its watch. "I'd like to stay," I said. "I think I'm ready to become part of this tradition." Then it settled. Sarah raised her glass of tea and a mock toast. "Welcome to the family business, Madison, both the human side and the other kind." We finished our drinks as full darkness settled over the farm, both of us comfortable in the knowledge that everything was secure and protected for another night. The orange cat purred loudly from its spot near my feet, and I could have sworn I saw the scarecrow's head tilt slightly in our direction, like it was acknowledging the agreement we'd just made.